Well, good morning, everyone. I think we will get rolling. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving break. And would just ask again one more time, make sure your microphones are muted. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Somebody's microphone is still live. We are here today at the palatial offices of the Swier law firm in Sioux Falls. Scott had an appointment over here, so we shifted from Avon to Sioux Falls today. And we've got some great information here, and I'm going to preface it a little bit with don't let it scare you too much. I think some of the things you're going to hear today will be worrisome, but I would tell you that I had conversation with the Department of Education when I heard about some of these things with making websites ADA compliant, and said, is there a way maybe we can, at the state level, provide some technology or something to help these school districts out? And I found out in that conversation that the DOE actually had received a letter from OCR, and they did some minimal compliance, and they have not heard back from OCR in quite some time. So, sort of tongue-in-cheek, the message was, don't worry too much about it. Don't get too excited, because I know the dollars it takes to bring this up to compliance is pretty expensive. And we don't want school districts to spend $10, $15, $20,000 on this kind of work if it isn't absolutely necessary. So with that, I'm going to switch it over to the PowerPoint here on the screen and turn it over to Scott. And again, we are recording this. If you have to step out or miss something, you can come back and listen to the recording. And again, I'll ask one more time, please make sure your microphones are muted. I'm still getting, I'm hearing myself come back through here, so somebody's microphone is still live.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for getting on this Monday morning. What we are going to talk about today are 10 frequently asked questions about website accessibility. And as Rob said, this area is going through a little bit of a change right now, and we're going to talk about that as we go through. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through a scenario this morning, and then we're going to talk about, as I said before, the 10 most frequently asked questions that school administrators have about website accessibility. So here is the scenario. You are sitting at your principal's or your superintendent's desk, and your school IT director comes in and says, hey, I've got a letter from the Department of Education. And what it is it's actually that your school has received a website accessibility complaint from the Office of Civil Rights, or OCR. And the complaint says that for various reasons, your district website is violating a couple provisions of federal law. Now, this is a very hot topic throughout the country. It's something in South Dakota that we're just starting to see a little bit. But as Rob said, before everybody gets too excited, I want to go through this scenario so I can give you the most up-to-date information on website accessibility. So that's our scenario. We've received a notice that your district website violates federal law. All right. So what do we do? Once we receive that notification, what do we do? All right. Question number one is, what laws require website accessibility? And there are two federal anti-discrimination laws that apply to website accessibility. The first is, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. And the second law is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, known obviously as Section 504. So those are the two laws that require school district websites to be accessible to disabled people. All right. So the first federal law, what is the ADA? The ADA says very simply that no disabled person can be excluded from participating in or be denied the benefits of services, programs, or activities of a public entity. So, does the ADA apply to school districts? Absolutely. When the ADA was enacted, website accessibility was something that obviously was not even on the radar because the internet didn't even exist when the ADA was first enacted. So when the ADA was enacted, this particular accessibility issue, not even a glimmer in the eyes of the ADA. However, when we look at the definition, services, programs, or activities of a public entity, that now includes a school district's website. So that's the portion of the ADA that affects website accessibility. All right. Question number 3 then, what is Section 504? Very similar. No disabled person can be excluded from participating in, be denied the benefit of, or be subject to discrimination under any program receiving federal financial assistance. So the carrot over the schools to comply with website accessibility under 504 is that technically you can have federal funds taken away if you do not comply with the website accessibility. So those are the 2 laws that websites are being reviewed under, the ADA and Section 504.
Scott, before we go any further, I just want to, I guess, put it out there. When we talk about ADA accessibility on websites, we all know ADA accessible for sidewalks, for buildings, all of that. When we're talking about websites, what really are they talking about? Text size, is that one of them?
They're talking about things like text size. They're talking about things where, let's say that you have a lot of documents that are in a PDF format on your website, and those are not accessible to people who may be blind.
Okay.
Color of your websites. There are some website colors that have an effect on certain disabilities. So it's all types of different things like that a disabled person cannot access because of that disability. Some people, it may be a mouse. Not able to physically manipulate a mouse. Is your website also accessible in a way that you don't have to use the mouse to navigate?
I know another big one when I visited the Department of Education was they have a lot of video clips on their website, and you had to actually go in and subtitle all of those videos.
Right. And that's why the process can get expensive to come up to date on the accessibility. But again, we're going to talk about that a little bit later because those costs hopefully are going to be lessened based upon the current state of the law.
Didn't mean to interrupt your presentation. I wanted everyone to kind of know what the ADA compliance was in this.
Okay. So question number 4 then, again, what is a disability? Under both the ADA and Section 504, very simple. It's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Very standard disability definition, very broad definition, as you can see, as to what could be considered a disability, which in turn is a very broad area in what your website has to be as far as accessible. Lots of different disabilities, lots of different items you have to consider when you talk about accessibility. Okay, so question always comes up. What is website accessibility? And here's what it means. It means that a person with a disability has to be able to perceive, to understand, to navigate, and to interact with your school district's website. Those are the 4 core components of website accessibility. Being able to perceive, to understand, to navigate, and to interact. All right. So that concept includes all disabilities that can affect the web. Disabilities such as visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, motor functions, which is where we talk about the inability to use a mouse or some limited fine motor skills, and also cognitive, learning disabilities, distractibility, inability to remember or focus on large amount of information. So when we talk about accessibility, we know we have those four cores: perception, understanding, navigation, interaction. And we know, of course, that we have to take into consideration visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, motor disabilities, and cognitive disabilities. So that, in a nutshell, is really what website accessibility is, that your school website is required to comply with under federal law. Okay, let's go back to the scenario where you've been provided with a letter from the OCR saying that they've received a complaint that your website is not accessible. So how is website accessibility enforced? And of course, it's enforced by the Office of Civil Rights, the OCR. For those of you who don't know, the OCR is actually a division of the U.S. Department of Justice. So OCR is a powerful organization. It's a well-funded organization, and as part of the U.S. Department of Education, it has a lot of tools available to it to enforce federal law. The OCR finds out, or how they enforce the website accessibility, is they can either do it through an administrative complaint, which is the most often seen way. They can also do it through bringing lawsuits. So they have a pretty big hammer over schools' head as far as how they can enforce. All right, question number 7. What do we have to do as a school district to make sure we comply? And again, your website cannot exclude disabled persons from online information. In a nutshell, that's what website accessibility is.
Before we go on to the next slide, I'll just remind everyone on the right side there is a place to type questions to Scott and myself. Just send them in there. We'll keep a watch on that text box, and if something comes in, we'll do our best to jump to it and answer it. So that's on your right side.
All right. So how does OCR investigate the complaint against the Avon School District, for instance? First thing OCR does is they determine, does the complaint actually have validity, or is this something that they've received a complaint from someone who has a different bone to pick with the school, but this is the way they went about it. So they'll look at the complaint's validity. Number 2, they'll determine, based upon the complaint, does OCR actually have the legal authority to go and investigate your school? The OCR also initially looks at timeliness. The general rule is that a complaint has to be filed with OCR within 180 calendar days of the last act that the complaint believes was discriminatory. So in other words, if somebody is looking at your website and believes that it's not accessible, and they make a complaint to OCR, that complaint normally would have to be made within 180 days of when that person first had an inkling that there may be non-compliance. All right, so that's the first thing OCR does. If it doesn't satisfy these first things, determine the validity, determine the legal authority, and determine timeliness. If it doesn't get beyond that first fundamental, the complaint is dismissed, and for the most part, a school wouldn't even know that a complaint was made. All right, let's say we get beyond that, and we'll go now to question number 9. All right, the OCR finds that, go back. Here's what OCR does. They will sit in their office and they'll actually review the Avon School District's website. They'll take a look, and on the initial blush, if they can just visually see that, yeah, it doesn't look like that particular school's website is accessible, then we go to the next thing. And that includes interviewing the person who complains. It also can be an interview of the employees. Everyone from the superintendent to the principal to the IT director. to any other employees that the OCR feels would be relevant to the investigation. They can also interview outside witnesses. For instance, if you use an outside vendor to either design or to upkeep your website, those outside vendors are undoubtedly also going to be part of OCR's investigative process. Okay, question 9. What if through that investigation, OCR determines that yes, the Avon School website is not accessible, that it violates either ADA and or 504? As a practical matter, here's what happens. There's always an attempt to secure a resolution agreement between your school and the OCR. In other words, let's try to work this thing out so neither party has to spend a lot of time and resources in dealing with this issue. So let's say that we are able to come to a pretty early resolution agreement. All right, what may that resolution agreement require of the school district? Okay, obviously making the website accessible. And the extent of the accessibility, of course, is dependent, number one, on just how out of compliance your current website is. And number two, how far does OCR want to take their investigation and their enforcement regarding your particular website? All right. So as an underlying tenet, we've got to make the website accessible to some extent. All right. These resolution agreements also often require a website auditor. And that website auditor can be your internal IT director if that person has the skills and the training to conduct the audit. The audit can also be done by an outside vendor. As most of you probably know, there are dozens of IT vendors throughout the country who are now specializing in nothing but school district website auditing. And if you Google them, you're going to get 2 or 3 pages immediately of all kinds of different companies who are doing these audits. Needless to say, it's become a somewhat lucrative area for these outside auditors, and the competition is pretty fierce, which in a way has been good for schools because everyone has to be somewhat cost conscious as a business. And if your auditing services are twice of what the person next door is, you may become non-competitive as a business goes. Most of the time, these resolution agreements, in addition to the auditor, they will also require the school to adopt accessibility policies. Those policies not only would apply to the current state of your website, but it would also require accessibility policies as issues come up into the future. So your accessibility policies are going to be a living, breathing document that's always going to be somewhat changing as technology changes. The resolution agreement is probably also going to require that your staff be provided with accessibility training. A lot of times that accessibility training will have to be given to any staff who has the ability to place content on the website. It could be your second grade teacher. If part of her curriculum is to place certain curriculum or certain study guides online through her individual homepage, that staff member is probably going to have to receive some type of accessibility training. The resolution agreement also is going to probably require that the school and OCR develop a corrective plan in addition to the policies. In other words, in the next 3 months, what is your school going to do to meet the criteria that OCR sets forth? What's going to be our corrective plan 6 months from now? What's going to be the corrective plan in 9 months? So the corrective plan will be set from the current time up until probably at least 9 months to a year in the future. Another item that the resolution agreement will probably require is you're going to have to post written notice to request inaccessible information. In other words, if we have a student who has a deafness disability, that person is going to have to be provided with notice as to how they can access, let's just say, video. How do they go ahead and say, hey, I can't hear the video, I need to be provided with subtitles or some other type of mechanism that allows him to access the information. Those notices are going to have to be conspicuously placed through the computer room or wherever else might be a common sense place to put the notice. But it gives the disabled person the ability to say, this is who I need to go to if I need to request accessibility that's not being provided to me under the website. Okay, so now that I've got you all somewhat fired up about, oh my goodness, how much is this going to cost my school? Recently, the Trump administration issued an executive order specifically regarding ADA website accessibility. What was happening during the Obama administration is that the Department of Education and the Department of Justice were actually in the process of creating administrative rules for website accessibility. One of the big rules was going to be a firm definition of accessibility. And there were a couple different accessibility modules that look like were going to be adopted. So the rulemaking process was going forward. Schools were obviously getting dinged all over the country because their websites were not accessible. The rulemaking process was almost coming to an end when we had an administration shift. And here's what the Trump administration did. They put the brakes on the ADA accessibility rulemaking. In other words, the Trump administration says any rulemaking that was done during the Obama administration has now been put on inactive status. Now, inactive status does not mean that the rulemaking is ultimately dead. It just means for right now, the rulemaking is inactive. It's not going to proceed in the foreseeable future from what all the tea leaves would show. But again, it doesn't mean it's dead. What that says in a nutshell is that the Trump administration has found that website accessibility and putting those potential costs on school districts to make your website accessible simply doesn't make a cost-benefit analysis sense. So again, they've put those rules on inactive. For the most part, schools have been somewhat relieved because the tens of thousands of dollars that it's probably going to cost to have most school websites accessible can now be put on the back burner. But again, simply putting the rulemaking on inactive status doesn't mean that the rulemaking is ultimately dead. It could be a change in administration. It could simply be a different focus for the Department of Ed or the Department of Justice. But for right now, it looks like everything is on hold regarding the rulemaking. Okay, so then the question becomes, what's the current status then of accessibility? What do we have to do as a school? All right. As we've said, from the OCR standpoint, the rulemaking is on hold, and it is not a point of emphasis as it was under the Obama administration. So the chances of the federal government coming down on schools has somewhat lessened because it's not a point of emphasis of the administration. However, private lawsuits by parents or by disability activist groups or anyone else, direct lawsuits against your school district are still possible. So that means the school district likely wouldn't have to go through the OCR process, but you can still be sued for website inaccessibility. So don't think that just because the administration has not made this a point of emphasis anymore, that your school is still totally out of the woods. A lot of the disability activist organizations throughout the country still have website accessibility as a main point of emphasis. But now, instead of starting that process through OCR, the process is probably going to have to start, for the most part, with a direct lawsuit in either state or federal court against the individual school districts. So, in 2017, when the Trump administration came out with the executive order, schools could somewhat take a breath. However, that still does not stop school districts from being personally sued by a person or an activist. So in a nutshell, those are the most frequently asked 10 questions for website accessibility. A little bit mixed bag right now of both good news, but also knowing that lawsuits are still possible if your website is not accessible. So with that,
we had a question come in, Scott.
All right.
And I'll go back and reiterate what I had said earlier, that the Department of Ed in South Dakota had received an OCR complaint and sort of tongue-in-cheek responded, and I've been waiting since then. But I guess my advice would be make sure you contact either Swier law firm and or your school attorney if you should get an OCR complaint or you have legal questions about what you should do. So our first question has come in. It says, can a district simply eliminate its website and not provide the service to anyone? Are districts required to provide a website service?
Yep, it's a good question. And it's a question that initially schools across the country that were having to pay out all this money for accessibility were asking. And I guess the question is can you do it? The answer is probably yes. However, as a practical matter, in 2017, for your school district not to provide a website is really, as a practical matter, just not going to happen. But technically, you could do that. And there were some schools that were threatening to do that as they were going through the OCR process. But I think even they found that in today's society, not having that online presence just flat out wasn't practical.
I think the benefits would outweigh taking it down for all the things you provide. And I've been a little more cognizant about looking at websites as I go to them, and really only one that I can recall seeing where they had some ADA compliance. If you're interested, you can go out and look at Ty's website. I saw that they had the ability to increase their font size and to flip-flop the colors of backgrounds and things. So if you want to go out and get a partial look at what it looks like, I believe Ty has done some of that so far.
You know, and where I would start with this is if you go back to our opening scenario, if you do get that letter or you get that lawsuit, the first thing that you should do is obviously see if your internal IT staff can conduct the audit. If you have people who are skilled in doing that, obviously saves the school a lot of time and money to do the audit in-house. And more schools are now trying to do that audit in-house just because of the cost basis of going with the outside audit. Some schools simply don't have the expertise to have an internal person conduct that type of an audit. But the first thing to do is go to your IT staff and say, hey, can you do this? Do we have the manpower to do this on our own? It would be a good thing, obviously, to try to nip any potential lawsuits or investigations in the bud by going to your IT person and saying, hey, is it time for us to look at this accessibility issue? And if so, can we do it in-house? Because after the lawsuit comes, you know, it may be a little late as far as avoiding the lawsuit, but it's always good to try to nip that in the bud before the legal proceedings start.
Other questions come in, Scott. Any concerns if a school has a Facebook page?
Any type of thing that you have that is online, that the school is in charge of, so to speak, anything online like that is going to have to be accessible. Whether it's your simple, not simple anymore, but your firm or your school webpage. If your school has a Facebook or a Google Plus or a Twitter account or anything like that, it's very likely that that particular online medium is also going to have to meet the accessibility standards just as your primary website would be.
As I thought about this, I thought about all the documents that you put up after a school board meeting. You put all your minutes up, you put all that up, and anything that goes up there has to be the text to voice, technically, to meet the requirement. I just thought, boy, what a nightmare to have to do all this.
And that's why the schools on the coast who were originally linked with this, it was a huge undertaking. Because, yeah, you don't think about things like school board minutes. You don't think about Mrs. Jones's second grade social studies topic being online that she puts up there. So when you think about everything that your school website has on it, it is daunting, and it was daunting for those schools who were the initial test case under these accessibility rules to become in compliance. Yeah, it is. It's mind-boggling to think of everything that we have on our school websites now.
This may be more of a comment. It follows along. I didn't even see this before I made that last statement, but it says, when I'm uploading PDFs onto the website, I sometimes receive a message stating something like, you may be uploading ADA compliant documents. If I continue to upload the documents and link them, would this be considered a willful violation of the law?
I think it would be a potential violation, yes, because you know that you are putting documents up there that are simply not accessible to some disabilities. And again, you may look at that and think, well, that's just crazy on what we have to do to make this accessible. Unfortunately, that is what was being required of schools.
I think this next question, Scott, ties back into what you said about Facebook and Twitter, but this one says, what if a teacher provides a website for their class?
Yep, same thing. That's going to have to be accessible. And that's where we go back to a lot of the resolution agreements are requiring any staff who posts on the school website to have training in ADA or in compliance so that their individual class website is indeed accessible. And that's where the training comes in. So almost any staff members now are posting to the internet. Anyone like that would have to have some type of training to make sure they're aware of the issue and also how they are going to comply with accessibility.
Well, I haven't seen another question come in yet, so I'm going to wait that awkward 7 seconds of silence before we close.
What we're going to do, everyone, is after the webinar today, we'll probably have it online tomorrow, and you'll get a notice of it. But we're actually doing a report, a free report for all the schools, and it's going to be entitled 14 Important Things Every South Dakota School Administrator Should Know About Website Accessibility. And we go through, obviously, the 10 questions that we did today, and then we add a few more. And hopefully it'll be a nice reference that if you are unfortunate enough to get the letter from OCR, or you are unfortunate enough to be sued because of your website's accessibility issues, hopefully this report will allow you to kind of take a breath, kind of, again, reaffirm what you need to do regarding this issue, and move forward in a pretty structured manner so that it gets done right.
So as soon as I get that document from Scott, I'll send that link out, or I'll send it along with the link to the recording of this. And didn't have to wait the 7 seconds of silence. We have another question. Is there a basic structure for the schools to review to make websites accessible? What do we have to do to make websites compliant?
That's a great question. The rulemaking process that we talked about under the Obama administration was actually going to adopt an international standard of website accessibility. It's called Web 2.0, and it has a bunch of other fancy technology terms on it. That was going to be the standard that was going to be adopted. And that standard would have said, schools, you have to do A, B, C, and D to be compliant. So at least then everyone knew what the rules of the game were. Because that rulemaking, again, has been deemed inactive by the Trump administration, that international standard that was going to be adopted is not adopted. So we do not have an A, B, C, D checklist of compliance as we would have had before, which unfortunately we go from knowing exactly what we were going to have to do to now not knowing what that standard is going to be. So what we would do under those situations is we would start to have to look at other states or other schools who have gone through the compliance process to see what they've done, to see what OCR has required them to do to be considered compliant. But unfortunately, we've gone from we were really close to having firm rules to now having those rules suspended in cyberspace somewhere, and we're probably not going to see them for the foreseeable future. So I wish I could tell you you can do A, B, C, and D to be compliant, and we were that close to having those rules. Now everybody's kind of hanging on there again.
So I'm waiting my 7 awkward. Oh, everyone just popped in. It sounds like adopting Web 2.0 would be a pretty decent start, was a comment made by one of the viewers.
Yep, and the Web 2.0 standard was the one that OCR was kind of informally telling schools, if you comply with the Web 2.0 standards, you're going to be fine. So yes, if you would say, even though it's not an official standard, but we are going to use the Web 2.0 standard for our school, you should be in good shape. And for those of you who don't know what that Web 2.0 standard is, I don't either. So go ahead and hopefully your IT staff would be able to tell you, here's what the Web 2.0 standard is, and maybe here's what we'd have to do with our website to get closer to that standard.
Okay, and with that, I don't see anything else coming in, so I'm going to thank all of you out there for dialing in today and joining me in the webinar. And absolutely thank Scott Swier for doing these. I think they're valuable, they're timely. We try and find things that are relevant and pressing out there, and I think this one is one of them. So Scott, thank you very much for inviting me over here to Sioux Falls and doing this.
Thanks for having me, as always.
And with that, we're going to shut it down, so have a great day, everybody.